There's never been a better time to play Dungeons & Dragons, but it's notoriously difficult to get started. There are free versions of the basic rules, starter kits, conventions. I even discovered an Adventurers League that plays the main campaigns that meets multiple times a week. Dungeons & Dragons has worked hard to remove as many hurdles as possible for you to learn the game. It even has fun, weird hooks like a new Stranger Things starter set. But if you're like most people, you've still never played because why would you start playing something completely different from anything you've ever played before? Dungeons & Dragons is not intuitive. It isn't like Scrabble. Getting started with Dungeons & Dragons in 2019 feels more like learning an improv format based around collaborative storytelling, but with very specific rules for combat and character customization. And it's not something you just learn on your own to play solo because it's a team sport that requires you to convince 3 or more friends to join you. Dungeons & Dragons is weird. It feels like a sport, and if you haven't been tuning into sports your whole life, why would you start now? Well, because collaborative fantasy gaming like Dungeons & Dragons is a gateway drug to the kind of games you haven't played since you were a kid in the sandbox. If you're a writer, Dungeons & Dragons is full of tools and ideas for how to write, and because it's collaborative, you don't have to do everything yourself. Stories emerge organically as you play, but I don't want to diminish the fact that learning Dungeons & Dragons is hard. At a minimum, Dungeons & Dragons requires you to buy and read the Player's Handbook, which has the instructions for creating characters, and you need a group of people who are committed to playing it together for 3 to 5 hours at a time, meeting over multiple weekends, playing a campaign that can last for months. But it's a bigger challenge for you, because if you're watching this video, you're probably the person that's going to be running the game. Before this year, I managed to avoid Dungeons & Dragons. I knew that it was a role-playing game that was associated with Satanism in the 1980s. It had awesome fantasy art. It was advertised in every comic book I read as a kid. I even read a comic adaptation of a Dungeons & Dragons campaign called Dragonlance when I was growing up. So I was roughly familiar, but I never played. But late last year, someone suggested that I would enjoy being a dungeon master. I knew there would be some reading involved, but I thought it would be like learning any new board game, so I scheduled the first campaign a month out and bought the main books. To understand what Dungeons & Dragons is today in its 5th edition, it's important to understand where the game started. Dungeons & Dragons started as a game called Chainmail, which was a supplement set of rules for medieval combat miniatures that included additional rules for spellcasting. All of Dungeons & Dragons systems are rooted in Chainmail's attempt to realistically represent medieval miniatures combat. This tells you everything about the kind of game Dungeons & Dragons is. While you no longer have to play with miniatures, combat is intended to be somewhat realistic, which is what grounds the fantasy elements and separates what Dungeons & Dragons does from the kind of fantasy game you might have played as a kid in the sandbox, and the kind of rules-based game that Dungeons & Dragons is. If you've ever played any turn-based role-playing video game, you have a leg up on understanding this. The example case I'd want to give is an NES game that I got as a kid, Dragon Warrior, where as soon as combat starts, everything stops. The whole world kind of explodes, and then you go into the combat view. And this is very much how Dungeons & Dragons feels. To start in combat, every player and monster rolls for initiative on a 20-sided die, which determines the order that actions take place. After that, players and monsters take turns moving and attacking, rolling a 20-sided die to determine if a given attack hits, and then additional dice to determine how much damage is dealt. There's a lot of combat in Dungeons & Dragons. In 30 days, you can only scratch the surface of the books that are published, and they're not inexpensive. I ended up buying 4 official Dungeons & Dragons books that retailed for $49.95. And surprisingly to me, these are all physical books. Digital versions are available via D&D Beyond, but you can't access your files while you're offline. I assumed there would be a Comixology-like app or subscription service that will allow you to borrow role-playing books, but there isn't. It feels like a limitation in the hobby that will always prevent wider adoption. In any event, the first things I bought were the 3 core Dungeons & Dragons books: the Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, and the Monster Manual. The Player's Handbook contains all the information you need to create characters. You select from 9 races and 16 classes. Now, each of these races and classes has different attributes that Dungeons & Dragons transforms into numbers and descriptions on a character sheet. It is a lot to go over all the character options with someone for their first game, which is why the starter set, which Dungeons & Dragons uses as their main onboarding tool, uses pre-made characters. But you want to make your own character, and you want it to be the best. As a Dungeon Master, if you have a friend who wants to play, it seems like you should schedule a separate time with that friend to work with them on creating their character versus having them come to your regularly scheduled campaign session. But once a player creates a character, the number of options they have is greatly reduced, and it's much easier to move forward. The Dungeon Master's Guide should be the second book that you read as a Dungeon Master, but not the first. It contains tons of great, but very intimidating information about how to create your own fantasy world. Before I started reading the Dungeon Master's Guide, I thought that Dungeons & Dragons was more of an established fantasy universe. But as you go through the Dungeon Master's Guide, you realize that all of the choices about the world are choices that you can make as the Dungeon Master. And those choices are as complex as you want them to be. It has so many overwhelming questions that you can get confused about what the game is about, when the best games arise much more from character choices than from your overall world choices. If you think about the best stories, whether they're books or movies, they're great because the characters are interesting and their choices are interesting. While it's likely that the Dungeon Master's Guide isn't designed to be the most intimidating book ever written, it has so many questions I couldn't answer that it set me out in the wilderness of Google, desperately looking for answers for how to run my first campaign. I wanted my campaign to be the best, without being insanely tedious, and so at some point, I started looking for published campaigns that I could use or get inspiration from. And that's when you realize how insane the Dungeons & Dragons hobby is. There are dozens of official campaigns in completely different universes that all sound fantastic, like Ravenloft, Eberron, Planescape, Dark Sun. I mean, you just have to see the fantasy art that evokes these worlds to get a sense of what they're about. A few Google searches led me to purchase Tales from the Yawning Portal, another official D&D book of published campaigns that included The Sunless Citadel, a well-reviewed campaign that would take players from levels 1 through 4. Campaign books are the most satisfying books to read as a new Dungeon Master. They're essentially deconstructed fantasy novels with all the fantasy bricks you need to run your adventures. Even if you never run a D&D campaign, you might love reading campaign books. And the way they're set up, they make you feel like you're a genius because they give you access to so many different ideas that you would never maybe have thought of normally. I mentioned I bought the monster manual as well. This was the least used item I purchased and is written more like an encyclopedia that you reference when you need the stats for a given monster than a book you read from cover to cover. Since combat encounters are such an integral part of the game, having a guide to the many different types of monsters is helpful and, as it turns out, necessary, since information about monsters is left out when they are listed in published campaigns. After 30 days, I had read the Dungeons & Dragons materials, but I felt like I was missing something. And I definitely was. Matt Colville's YouTube channel, where he talks directly to new Dungeon Masters, and the excellent books The Lazy Dungeon Master and Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master. Matt Colville has specific tips in his YouTube series for good sample adventures to use in order to softly prepare your friends for the world of Dungeons & Dragons. I took the quest that he outlined and used it almost verbatim. As it is, I spent 80% of the first 3-hour play session helping people create their characters, which I wasn't good at because I spent so much time reading campaign books and planning for things that weren't going to happen. So I couldn't quickly answer most of my friends' character-related questions. I was also surprised at the overall slow pace of the game. After looking and reading specifically about the Sunless Citadel campaign online, it was unclear to me how long it would take to go through the dungeons. I'm now into running the 3rd session of the game, and it seems like less is more. The Lazy Dungeon Master has an amazing checklist of preparation that helps you reduce the overall prep time for every gameplay session to 3 hours, which is much better than the unknown amount of days I spent for my first game. I have no idea what it's like to play D&D because I've always been the Dungeon Master. And as a Dungeon Master, it feels like you have the most work to do when preparing for the game. Your job is prep. You're setting up all the elements in the world and hopefully in a way where the player characters get to have cool adventures. But after you over-prepare and give yourself anxiety about it, you realize you need to step back and have a more careful balance with your game prep. You want to do enough prep to be confident, but it needs to be the right kind. For me right now, the right prep for a game is to reduce whatever campaign I'm working on to the fewest number of necessary components. There's a great list I found online of 5-room dungeons. This PDF was so helpful to me since it gave me permission to remove elements from published dungeons that I didn't like. I thought initially that people would want to explore every room in a large dungeon, but large dungeons are full of tedious elements. It's much more interesting if there are fewer rooms in a given dungeon with only the things that are interesting to me as the Dungeon Master, versus strictly following the campaign guidelines. Dungeons & Dragons is fun. It's a challenging learning experience, but a fun gateway into the world of role-playing. Since I've started, I've gotten the kick to run other games and read a ton of other role-playing books. Just recently I ran Monster of the Week, an RPG based on the Apocalypse World engine, and I'm planning on running One Ring, which is a Lord of the Rings themed role-playing game, Pathfinder, and The Witcher role-playing game. I don't know if Dungeons & Dragons is the best role-playing game to start with if you want to learn role-playing games, but every game has been someone's first, so there isn't a wrong answer for where to start learning role-playing games. If you like videos like this, be sure to subscribe to my channel and let me know in the comments what you liked or didn't like about the video, and what you wish you knew when you Dungeon Mastered your first Dungeons & Dragons game. Thanks for watching.